the church is actually kind of leading the charge on that. Major news outlets have picked up what the churches of Christ are doing in the Ukraine with these buckets, and I think they're 5-gallon buckets from what I could tell, like paint buckets, things like that. All right. We are in 2 Kings 6 and verse 1 tonight. We're going to look at, so you have the miracle that takes place in 6, 1 through 7, and then an interaction between the king of Syria and Elisha. And then what starts in 24 at the end of the chapter, when the Syrians surround Samaria, actually keeps going all the way through the end of chapter 7. I don't know exactly how far we'll get. We'll be doing good to cover the 6th chapter tonight, but anyway, just keep that in mind. The chapter divisions are human-made, and they're good, obviously. I wouldn't want to say, drop open your Bible and kind of see if you can find this phrase somewhere. It's good to have chapters and verse divisions, but at the same time, remember that a chapter division, it's not like the person who was sitting down to write the book said, okay, end of thought, let me start a new thought in a new chapter. And so a lot of times the narrative will flow over several chapters, and we need to keep that in mind. All right, so we've been in this long series of miracles that Elisha has been doing, and we're going to look at one of the last ones, although obviously some of the things that take place with the first interaction in verses 8 through 23 with the king of Syria could also be described as miraculous. But here, this seems to be the kind of the end of that particular section of stories, and this is about the floating axe head. So let's read it, and then we will back up and try to break it down a little bit. Verses 1 through 7. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, see, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there. And he answered, go. Then one of the servants said, be pleased to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So he went with them. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water and cried out, alas, my master, it was borrowed. Then the man of God said, where did it fall? When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, take it up. So he reached out his hand and he took it. Okay? So first, we're in most likely Gilgal at this time. That's the most likely location. And it says the sons of the prophets, which we have mentioned and have seen quite a bit in these chapters. So we're dealing with that school, that training school for the prophets. And so it says, they said to Elisha, see, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Does anybody's translation read differently than the place where we dwell? I'm sorry? Too straight for us? Okay. Anything about the structure itself? So when they said where we dwell, does anybody's read differently than dwell? Meet? Okay. That's kind of, dwell is kind of a deceptive term. Because when I read that, I think of the place that housed them, right? Where they all stayed, and maybe like a dormitory type thing. But that's, the idea behind the word is kind of like their meeting hall. And so we might think of this kind of like their school or classroom or something like that, where they would get together and the training would take place. And so what they're actually wanting to do is build a school, and so, or enlarge the school. So we're seeing that the school of the prophets is growing. And so even though things are dim, God is still raising up people. And they're from the 10 northern tribes, and they're not, not everybody has gone, just crazy. And that's something we need to keep in mind, because we can get into we can quickly get into a defeatist attitude that everything is going terrible and nothing good is happening. The only problem is that's just not true. I mean, sure, we've got some problems, but in the traveling that I get to do and go and interact with Christians in other parts of the United States, there's some amazing stuff going on, and there are some amazingly talented people at work. And So we've got a lot of good things going on, and we need to remember that in the midst of even some of the discouraging times. So they said, let's build a new school, a new lecture hall, whatever you want to call it. This one is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each of us get there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there. So every person just kind of cut their own tree, and depending upon how many this is, they say, that'll be enough. We'll bring enough wood to build a new place. And he answered, go. Then one of them said, be pleased to go with your servants. And he answered, I will go. So they want him to be involved in the process as well. So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, alas, my master, it was borrowed. Okay? Now, again, this is probably not your classic American custom axe that they're using. Okay? I still remember when my parents built their house, so the lot we got was like a jungle. And Dad had teenage boys, so what that means is he uses powerful tools and we use primitive tools. I mean, that's what it meant. You swung the axe. That's what you did. Or the Kaiser blade or whatever it is, that's what you did. But even, our American axes are pretty well put together, but even when he was talking to us about this and showing us how to use them, he would talk to us about, even no matter how good it is, there's still a possibility that head can slip off. And so you need to pay attention to what you're doing, and you need to pay attention to where you are if someone else is using it. Okay? Now, go back even further in history before they have some of these modern advancements, and you can kind of understand how quickly this axe head can fly off and really create a problem. Now, but the problem is more than just the axe head, okay? So he's felling the log, and he says, alas, my master, it was borrowed. It was borrowed. It's not mine. And so what you see, these prophets were not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. But it being borrowed, so first of all, if it's borrowed under the law, if something breaks or is lost that you have borrowed from someone, what's your obligation? You're going to replace either it or give the money that can replace it. Now, this is because if you look at the end of verse 6, it says he made the iron float. So this is an iron axe head. Okay? So to put this in perspective, let's look at 1 Samuel 13 for just a second. Let's put this in perspective. 1 Samuel 13, we're going to look at 19 to 22. Okay, so in verse 19 it says, now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistine says, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords and spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for the sharpening of the axes, for the setting of goads. So on the day of battle, when there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. They were going to war, and the only people who had weapons were Saul and Jonathan. Israelites didn't have the capability to do all these things yet. Okay? And so, first of all, they're kind of behind the curve in that technology, but they also, it's extremely expensive when you have a free market and you have something and there's a high demand for it and people will pay for it. Well, you're going to jack your price. And that's exactly what goes on. And so what is lost here is something pretty substantial financially, and is going to create a problem for him. He's not going to be able to pay it, otherwise he'd have had his own. So it creates a situation for him that is very difficult. And we've already run into this when one of the widows of the sons of the prophets ran out of money as well. It says, verse 6, then the man of God said, where did it fall? And he showed him the place he cut off of a stick and threw it in and made the iron float. And he said, take it up. So he reached out his hand and he took it up. And so he made the iron float. I'm not the best person at science in the world, but I'm pretty sure iron doesn't normally float. Okay? So what you're seeing is something that is miraculous. Now, there's always going to be this guy that tries to come along and basically undo every miracle you'll read about in the Bible. And so they range from, decent argument to flat out humorous. And one of them comes along and says, well, what he did, it was a big log, and the pressure from the log pressed the water down, and that made, no. That would not make, the Jordan River is too big. You don't do that, okay? And so this is a constant flowing, muddy, nasty river. And so when he lost it, you'd pretty much kiss it goodbye, basically. And so this is a miracle that Elisha performs in order to help this particular prophet. And so what it shows us, what we've seen when we looked at all these miracles, is that Elisha is involved on big scale things, like in chapter 3 when all these 3 kings go to war. He's got influence there. He's involved in rebuking unrighteousness in Samaria, or Bethel. Well, I said Samaria, Bethel at the end of chapter 2. So he's done a lot of different things. But one of the amazing things about it is that the things that we would consider to be trivial, God still takes an interest in them. A lot of people would have been like, well, you're on your own. You should have been more careful. Why would God perform a miracle to get a guy's axe head back? Don't ever assume that God is not concerned with the small things in our lives. There's too much throughout Old and New Testaments that show that God is concerned with every single aspect of our lives. And, don't be afraid to talk to him about those things. And, God is not burdened by us, right? And we need to keep that in mind and be willing to just talk to him. He enjoys the communion with us. He created us for that. And, he understands that we have concerns, and he understands obviously how they're going to play out, but doesn't mean he's not concerned with them. And so just a small reminder that I need myself. Don't get the notion that God is somehow annoyed with us when we talk to him about things that we think, I was at a comedy show recently, and the guy was dealing with some Christian things. He's like, I ain't praying for that. That was his whole spiel there for a few minutes. And it was humorous, okay? It was funny. I got the point that he was making. It was funny, but at the same time, biblically speaking, yes, you should pray even about the smallest and the most mundane things. And God will certainly be interested in it. All right, let's look then at this. Or any questions or anything on that before we go? I think it's just a stick. If it were something like Moses, where his rod is always mentioned, I'd say it's probably significant. But because we have no indication of Elisha with a stick at any other time or anything else, it seems like he probably just picked up a log or a stick of some kind and just chunked it. And so I don't personally think it's significant. It could be, but I don't see it right now.
Elisha didn't pick up the axe head.
No.
He told the man to pick up the axe.
Yes. And some of that has to do with the John 11 type stuff. God won't do for us sometimes what we can do for ourselves. When Lazarus is called forth, Jesus tells the people to unbind him. And one of the principles behind that is that God is going to aid us and he's going to help us, but it doesn't mean we get to sit on our hands and not be involved in the process either. So, all right. Anything else before we move to this interaction with the Syrians? All right. So if you drop this all the way back to 1 Samuel and then fast forward to where we are. So in 1 Samuel, the major nation that gave Israel problems were the Philistines. You see that early on in the book. You see it with the reign of Saul. You see it with David. David kind of puts an end to that animosity and kind of just puts them down for a good portion of time. And then we never really, I mean, they're there, they're an annoyance, but they're not a threat anymore. Okay? So, but what we've seen develop in the Kings from 1 Kings 15 forward, that the nation that is giving Israel fits is Syria. Okay? Or some translations, more modern translations, may say Aram or the Arameans. I think the Christian Standard Bible translates it that way. And so Syria is this region kind of northeast of Israel. And so, for an example, Damascus, right? The Apostle Paul was there to persecute Christians. He had made his way there. That was the capital of Syria. So that kind of gives you a general idea of where we are. So they created a lot of problems. We've run into them in 1 Kings 20 when Ahab refused to kill the king. We've run into them in 22 when they go to war. We've run into them on several occasions, and we're going to run into them more here. Now, what's going to be interesting is because Syria is going to be on a decline, and Assyria, put the A in front of it, is going to be on the rise, and then it's going to be Assyria that's giving us problems in the Kings. And then Assyria is going to be on the decline, and then it's going to be Babylon that gives us problems. Okay? So it's kind of, we're walking through these historical barriers from the Philistines to the Syrians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians. And so that's what we're seeing here. Now in verse 8 it says, "Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, 'At such and such a place shall be my camp.'" Now to kind of put this in perspective, I want to skip down to the bottom of verse 23, because it sounds like this is an all-out war. But in verse 23 it says, and the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. And so it seems like this is not a full-fledged war as much as it is these raids that they would go on. You remember from the last chapter, how did the little Israelite girl end up in Naaman's household? When was she taken? Taken from one of the raids in Syria, right? And so it's not uncommon. You even see David do it at the end of 1 Samuel. He'll go on raids and pillage a city and take their goods. And so it's a way to kind of increase your wealth without having an all-out war. You kind of nibble around the edges without jumping in with both feet. And so it seems like that's what's going on here in this process. And so the Syrian king says, I'm going to make my camp at a certain place. Verse 9, "But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, 'Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there.' And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God had told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice." And so there are a couple things going on here. Obviously, Elisha is telling him what's going on. He's feeding him the information. Now, Elisha knows it miraculously. He hears what's going on, and then he passes it on to the king. So a couple of things that are happening. Number one, when we got to 2 Kings chapter, when we were in chapter 3, when they started to go to war with Moab, maybe? Anyway, it's in chapter 3. And they come to meet with Elisha. You remember what Elisha says? "It's a good thing you're here, King of Judah, because if you weren't here, I wouldn't let him in the door." Talking about the king of Israel. Okay? And so it seems as if maybe that relationship has been somewhat repaired. Okay? If not repaired, it does also show God being extremely gracious and extremely patient, because he's extending an olive branch. This man is actively involved in Baal worship, and God is extending him an olive branch, giving him information he could not know on his own. And so what you're seeing is God's grace being extended to a person that we would look at it and say, why would you do that? Why would you extend an olive branch? Why would you help this guy? I mean, he's got what's coming to him. And one of the things is that God is a lot more patient than we are with people. He doesn't give up on people so easily. We have a tendency to do that. And that's an area where we have to become more like God, is in our patience with people. And really, even patience, many of us don't have a problem being patient with ourselves. When we do the wrong, we expect people to be patient with us because we say, what? I'm not perfect. We have a hard time reversing those roles. When somebody else does wrong, we don't want to be as patient with them. And it's problematic. Because, and one of the things that will help us in that process is, first of all, realizing that God is being extremely patient with me. I may think I've got it together, but not really. I mean, who is the person who doesn't still struggle with sin? I haven't met them yet. And knowing that God continues to be patient with you and your sin, if we spend all of our time, if we spend a greater portion of our time focusing on our own struggles, it allows us to be extremely patient with the person and their struggles. Because we're sitting here thinking, okay, it might be different than mine, but I'm in the same boat. I'm in the same boat here. I mean, aren't all sins, if we're not penitent of them, if we don't fight back against them, if we embrace them, aren't we all in the same boat regardless of what they are, whether it be lying or killing somebody? And so we have to, and if we're honest, how easy is it for you to make a change in your life? It's not easy for me. You come across something, you're studying something, or somebody points something out to you and you realize, hey, I haven't been right in that. I've been wrong in that. And I need to try and rectify that. How easy is it for you to just immediately flip that switch and be done with it? I can't speak for you, but I know for me, that's not easy. And so when I can understand that in myself, and I see somebody else struggling to flip that switch, you just learn, like, there's a sense of patience. And one of the things that I've seen in the study of these kings is just how patient God is with people. He extends olive branch after olive branch after olive branch after olive branch to people. And hoping that they will take it, hoping that they will be penitent. And I think that should inform the way we operate with some things as well. All right, verse 11. Then the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? So what does he think is happening? We've got a spy. How else does this happen? How else does he know exactly where we are and is able to avoid this situation? Or he's always ready for us? Well, at some point, you kind of, a lucky try, maybe once or twice, he gets it right. But when it's consistently, somebody's got to be feeding him information. That's the only other explanation in his mind. So, verse 12, and it says, one of the servants said, none, my lord, none of us are traitors, O king. But Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. Okay? That is kind of hyperbolic in its expression, what you speak in your bedroom. That is, he knows what you're doing, okay? And he reveals what you're doing to the king of Israel. And he said, verse 13, go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him. It was told him, behold, he is in Dothan, which is about 12 miles north of Samaria. So he sent there horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. Now, how much sense does that make? All right, walk with me here for a minute. What is Elisha doing? What is he doing to the king of Syria? What does he know? He knows his movements. He knows his plans. So in response, let's go get him. Am I the only one that sees that as being dumb? He can read your battle plans. Why do you think he's not going to read this one? Okay? And that's because anger and pride and rage send us into doing things that make no sense. They don't make any sense. Now look, if a guy is over here and he's reading my thoughts, and I know nobody's funneling him information, you know, I might want to go talk to that guy. He might know something. He might be something that's maybe got something to say that I need to hear. Why would I go and kill a guy who's got the ability to read my mind? By the way, fast forward, that's what happened in the New Testament. The Jews killed Jesus even though they knew he could read their minds, but their anger and their pride and their rage blinded them. That they thought the answer was killing him. Instead of coming to him saying, you know what? Only one person can read minds, and that's the omnipotent God. You must be him. I need to talk to you. They go the other way. And so it reveals something about our human nature that we don't always make good, consistent decisions. And certainly when we are upset and we are prideful and basically our pride has been hurt, you know, we just make, and that's why I think it's very, very important that when we are upset, one of the best pieces of advice I was given years ago, advice I was given years ago was never miss a good opportunity to shut up. Just never miss a good one to shut your mouth. I don't know about you, but the times I've reacted when I was upset, I've regretted a lot of those times. But the times I waited and simmered down, I don't regret pretty much any of those interactions. So anyway, something for us to think through. So in verse 15 it says, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? So who's this servant? Well, probably not Gehazi, because as we saw at the end of chapter 5, he's got leprosy. So most likely it's not him. It's a new guy on the scene, right? And so you can kind of see how he gets a little spooked. I mean, I know I would. He goes out and he sees, you know, he sees this army. And, you know, sometimes we're pretty hard on biblical characters. People, their lives are recorded in Scripture, and we're like, you know, why did they struggle with that? You know, shouldn't they have? I mean, my favorite one is faithless Peter walking on the water. I hear people say that all the time. Hey, faithless people don't walk on water. He had a moment where he made a mistake. But what's amazed me about that description is Peter gets all the bad rap because he begins to sink. Now, the 11 other unbelievers who wouldn't even step a foot out of the boat, they get a free pass. And you know, you think, well, if I'd have been there, I'd have done it. No, you wouldn't. I ain't getting out of a boat. That's like jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. Why in the world would you do it? So when we look at people like this and we say, okay, so here's this servant, and he's nervous that he's surrounded by this army. You know, that's a lack of faith in him. I mean, I just kind of feel like that's generational arrogance, where we're looking at it like, you know, that's a lack of faith in him as we sit in a nation that is perfectly in peace, and we've never really seen the ugliness of war in our own borders. And there's more faith involved in this than we would care to think. Because I got to be honest with you. If I'm somewhere and the city I'm in is surrounded by a foreign army, I do at least what he did, if not a whole lot more. So putting ourselves into the shoes of these people is very, very important. That we understand what it means to exercise faith. And this is going to get, the reason I make the point here is because this is going to amp up throughout the rest of 2 Kings. Because there's going to be an Assyrian besieging of the city of Jerusalem, where God is going to miraculously deliver them. There's going to be a besieging at the end of this chapter that carries over into chapter 7. And we look at them and we say, why are they not trusting God? Because they're doing exactly what we would do in their shoes. It's one thing to say, I would have faith to take care of me. It's another thing when you haven't eaten in 20 days and there's no hope of getting food into your city, and you've got people who are ready to decapitate you outside of the wall. Like it's a whole different level of what's going on. So the servant is obviously concerned. Elisha himself stays what seems to be as cool as a cucumber. He says, don't be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And the servant's sitting here thinking, you got an army I don't know about? I don't see them. Then Elisha prayed in verse 17, and he said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain or the hill was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So he has his eyes opened, and he sees these chariots and horses of fire, which, by the way, is we've already seen before what happened. We ran into them earlier in this book. Not Elisha, but Elijah. How did he get to heaven? Okay. Same thing. Here they are. And they're standing around and they're protecting. And so it's that his sense of calm is there. This whole interaction is kind of, not exactly the same, but it's similar to the garden where Peter, he goes after Malchus, and because he's a fisherman and not a swordsman, he goes for his head and he gets his ear. Okay? He meant to split his head open. He hit his ear because he's a fisherman. He has no idea what he's doing with a sword. That's the truth. There are some somewhat comical things in Scripture if you think about them. But Jesus tells him to put up the sword. And then he says, can't I call 12 legions of angels right now if I wanted to? I don't need your help. Like, if I wanted to end this thing, I'd end it. A legion is 6,000, so 72,000 angels, which was more legions, just shy of about as many legions as the Roman army had at that time. He said, I got it. I can handle it. And that protection is there. And to what degree that protection continues, that's a whole angel study. And to be honest with you, the answer at the end of the day is nobody really knows what they do. Hebrews 1 does give us the idea that they are involved in our world and that they do things of which we will never know this side of eternity. They're invisible beings, and what it is that they do all the time, I don't know. And I understand that this is a special case. I'm not saying that there's a flaming horses and chariots around us at all times, or guardian angels or anything like that. But sometimes we don't spend enough time thinking about the spiritual side of things that in our existence. And I know I think if we did, I don't know if I did more, I think it would change how I thought about some things. But anyway, we'll pick up there hopefully next Wednesday night and then move forward.